So, weak or strong? And I want to look at some examples of strong presidents, but also weak presidents so that we know a little bit of the difference. So, first, let's just start off with the one who set precedent for all the other presidents, and that would be George Washington. George Washington. Now, he is considered by historians and many other analysts to be one of the top three greatest presidents. He's either number one, two, or three, depending upon the order. And you might think, well, how hard could that been since he was just starting off and setting up the job and everybody else after him kind of had to follow what to do? Well, that was the point. You can do it right once the first time and give everyone an example to follow, or you can screw up. And he was able to do a distinguished and professional job, despite the fact that he was not really a politician himself. Yesterday, we mentioned negative presidents, presidents that maybe didn't enjoy it. And he didn't necessarily look forward to a lot of the pomp and circumstance and fanfare that went on. He was sometimes embarrassed by it. But he considered it his civic duty to come back into public life and become president of the United States, even though he had retired from his military career. So, at this personal sacrifice, he decided to take up the presidency. And when he put together the first cabinet, he realized he didn't have expertise in every area. So he brought in a bunch of different people with various philosophical opinions and areas of expertise that could help advise him. So he included a cabinet with a lot of diverse opinions and intellect to give him the best ideas possible. And he also knew that the new government in its infancy would be tested and that they couldn't make it look weak. They couldn't see that it would back down, or else there really wouldn't be a point in having it at all. So, for instance, when Congress levied taxes on whiskey to raise money in West Pennsylvania, there was a small rebellion, and so George Washington personally volunteered to lead the troops to crush it. Luckily, of course, most of the people had either gone home or intoxicated by the time the military got there. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but it showed that he was willing to stand up to any type of problems that would occur in order to keep order in this country. And there are some detractors that might say he's a little weak because he needed to rely on other people to help make up his mind, especially Alexander Hamilton kind of led the opinion of George Washington on more than one occasion. But once again, of course, Hamilton was an expert on money and finance, and the Treasury Department was his. So it's only natural that Washington would follow his lead on some of those major issues they had to talk about since the economy wasn't that good shape after the Revolutionary War. So he's an example of a strong leader. Another one that would be strong would be Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson used the full force of the presidency, particularly the one power that the president has, and that would be to veto legislation. He ended up vetoing more bills than the previous 6 presidents combined. He believed that the Congress was spending too much, that it didn't really have a lot of business engaging in national building projects. He thought that should be up to the states. But even though he believed in state power, he also didn't believe that states should do what they want. And so, for instance, South Carolina believed they didn't have to help collect tariffs that Congress had levied on imports. And when they nullified the law, basically saying we don't have to follow whatever the national law is, Jackson, like Washington before him, threatened to send troops to South Carolina to force them to follow the law. So even though he believed in states' rights, he also believed that the Union came first. Now, he is known as a strong leader by most historians, and he's usually rated in the top 10, but he does have some black marks on his record, particularly the Trail of Tears, allowing Native Americans to be forced out of the South. So it is possible to be a strong leader and still make some mistakes and generally do things that maybe in hindsight weren't that great in the first place. Now let's talk about one of the weak leaders rated as one of the worst presidents, and that would be President Tyler. What's that? Never even heard of him? Well, he's probably glad because there's a couple of reasons why. John Tyler was the first president to inherit the office. The previous one had actually died after only 30 days in office. And so Tyler became president. Now, there's a little bit of concern about that because it says the powers would go to the vice president of the United States, but it didn't actually say that he would be sworn in and called Mr. President and things like that. And of course, your cabinet is often filled with a lot of politically ambitious people. So the cabinet really wanted him just to be acting president so that way they could be in charge. And so there was actually debate about whether he should actually become president. Well, he took a stand and got sworn in the middle of the night, and that magically made him president. And that's what he basically wanted to be addressed as. If anybody wrote him letters addressing acting president, he had them sent back or thrown away. So his cabinet, most of them quit, and the Congress stopped cooperating with him. He probably did the right thing in setting a precedent, but unfortunately for him, it made him incredibly politically weak, and he didn't even get renominated to run for president later on. So it's a good idea to take a stand, but it's also a good idea to talk about this with other people beforehand, so that way you have at least some cooperation. And the next president is considered often one of the worst in American history, Pennsylvania's own James Buchanan. James Buchanan was president when the Civil War started. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president of the United States in 1860, and of course the South totally disagreed with that. So the Deep South, the most southern states, started seceding from the Union. And even though that was an illegal action, James Buchanan believed that. He thought they shouldn't be allowed to. He didn't really do anything about it. He just let it happen. And so in the meantime, the deep southern states started raising an army and seizing federal supplies and taking over federal bases. And so really they were getting away with a lot of war preparation that they knew would happen because James Buchanan was unwilling to do that. And this was kind of classic with his personality. Before this happened, there was a Supreme Court case involving slavery called the Dred Scott case. And he urged the Supreme Court to take it on because he figured once the Supreme Court made a decision about slavery, then we would never, ever have to worry about it again. And so really this actually helped the Civil War happen even faster. And so James Buchanan was not exactly a strong leader. But of course, he was followed by one of our strongest presidents, rated by historians once again in the top 3, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was willing to do almost whatever it would take in order to keep the Union together. He believed correctly that the Confederacy was an illegal, treasonous movement, and so he quickly sent troops down into the South. He refused to let any federal troops leave their post unless, of course, it was strategically impossible to keep it. And he saw to it, of course, that the Union would be held together. He also advocated for Congress to eventually pass the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery, even though the president personally doesn't have anything to do with it. And in order to do all this, he did some things that were questionable. He often authorized military use and expanding the army and adding governmental powers before Congress gave him permission. He also tended to have people arrested in the border states if he knew that they were going to end up going to the Confederacy. Maryland, for instance, which stayed in the Union. The only reason why they did is because when the Maryland state legislature was going to vote to secede and join the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln had part of their legislature arrested. That, of course, stopped the vote from happening. So he often did pull stuff like that. But toward the end of his presidency, he showed that he was willing to give up all this power and actually forgive the South. His plans for readmitting the southern states was actually quite generous and forgiving. So just like George Washington, he was willing to set personal feelings aside and do the right thing, except in this case, it would be to give up a large amount of power. Following him would be, later on, a couple presidents later, would be Ulysses S. Grant. And you would think a Civil War general would make a powerful, strong leader. And maybe that is the case when he was general, but it wasn't the case when he was president. Ulysses S. Grant was a negative, passive president. He didn't really want the job. He did it because everyone thought, hey, it'd be a good idea for a general to be in charge. And he also didn't really want to be involved with it on a day-to-day basis. So like George Washington, he set up a cabinet to kind of make all the decisions, but he never really checked in on them or tried to force through any type of important policies. In fact, he tried to avoid the White House as much as possible. Now, this wouldn't have been bad necessarily in a dull decade, but remember, this is after the Civil War, so newly freed slaves have to be protected. And he did try to do that to some extent, but it probably could have been a much greater effort. And on top of that, some of his friends were also quite greedy. And so they ended up pilfering not only the federal government, but also Grant's personal finances. He actually ended up being taken advantage of quite a bit. And it took him a long time to ever come around and realize some of these people were taking advantage. He just wanted to believe it wasn't true. So Grant actually ended up going broke afterwards. So he is an example of someone who might have seemed like a strong leader, but ended up being a weak one. And then there's FDR. He tops out those three highest ranked people in history. And you already know a lot about FDR. He believed in strength of the federal government to confront the Great Depression, which was unusual because before that, nobody really wanted the federal government to be involved in the economy. He also led the country through World War II, picking the right generals and admirals to lead, but not micromanaging the war like some other people might have done. And of course, he knew that we would have to take some pretty extraordinary leaps to end the war, so he authorized the Manhattan Project, which developed, of course, the nuclear bomb. So, a lot of things, of course, that he gets attributed with, but that's also because he won election 4 times. He's the only person that broke George Washington's precedent. And so he was elected 4 different times and died partway through his 4th term. And that is, of course, why we eventually passed the 22nd Amendment to officially limit it to 2 terms in office. And once again, just because you're a strong leader and you do a lot of great things doesn't necessarily mean everything is perfect. A Japanese internment, for instance, would be one of the examples under FDR. And then the last 2 that I want to talk about, I'll put together. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. Now, a lot of people say, why can't we have a good man in office or a good woman or just someone with good moral values? And Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter are probably 2 of the best people that were ever in office, but they were also 2 of the weakest, most incompetent presidents in American history. Because it's easy to say, let's do the right thing, but it's also easy to get walked all over. Gerald Ford believed that the country had been through a traumatizing experience with the Watergate scandal. And so Nixon, of course, had resigned before he could be impeached. But Ford decided to pardon him for any crimes he may have committed, which was kind of a big get out of jail free card. People were very suspicious of it. But of course, he believed it was just the right thing to do. Historians agree. But unfortunately, that kind of bogged down the rest of his presidency. That, along with economic problems and the fact that he was kind of a goofy person, kind of doomed his presidency. He was followed by Jimmy Carter, same thing. He was a good person. He believed by leading by example. There was an energy crisis. So, for example, he turned down the heat at the White House and just started wearing sweaters, say, see, we can make it through this, and we just make some kind of sacrifice. But Americans generally don't like to hear that. And so he also was mostly unpopular during his administration. He tried to make peace and kind of patch up America's reputation during the Cold War. Of course, trying to compete with the Soviets, we became known as more of a country just trying to get what it wants. So he started making peace deals with countries, giving back the Panama Canal to Panama, for instance. And even though that helped repair some of our reputation in Latin America, some Americans looked on it as giving up on the past. And so these 2, even though they are probably 2 of the more moral presidents ever to be in office, are sometimes rated as some of the weakest. So hopefully you have picked out 3 major things that you can write down about weak or strong.